When Japan surrendered in August 1945, the country entered a moment that was unlike anything it had ever experienced. The war had ended, but the problems had not. Cities were burned. Food was scarce. People were exhausted, and the future was a clouded, uncertain space. And for the first time in its long history, Japan would be occupied by a foreign power. From 1945 to 1952, the American occupation reshaped every part of Japanese life. Schools, laws, cities, families, work, culture, and the structure of government all shifted quickly. For civilians, the occupation was not just a political event. It was a daily experience that affected meals, jobs, relationships, and identity. Today, we will look at what life was actually like for Japanese civilians during the American occupation. How people survived, how they adapted, what changed, what was lost, and how these 7 years created the foundation of the Japan we know today. Let's start on the day everything changed. The shock of surrender. On the 15th of August, 1945, most Japanese civilians heard the emperor's voice for the first time. The radio crackled. The language was formal and distant. Many people struggled to understand his words, but the meaning slowly settled in. Japan had accepted defeat. The war was over. The emotions were complicated. Some people felt relief. Others felt shame. Many cried. Some sat in silence, unsure what the future would bring. Civilians had been told for years that surrender was unthinkable, and that American soldiers would be brutal if they ever landed in Japan. Now those soldiers were coming, and people did not know what to expect. Families hid valuables. Women worried about their safety. Parents told children to stay close. People tore down patriotic posters and burned documents that might attract attention from the occupation forces. Even as relief spread through the country, fear remained. But fear did not last forever. When American troops finally arrived, many civilians were surprised by what they saw. The first encounters. When the first American soldiers walked through Japanese cities, civilians watched quietly from windows, balconies, or side streets. The troops looked nothing like the monstrous figures described in wartime propaganda. They were young, curious, and often smiling. Some handed candy to children. Others waved to people watching them pass. These early interactions mattered. They softened the atmosphere and began breaking down the wall of fear. Civilians learned that American soldiers were not there to punish them. They were there to occupy, stabilize, and reshape Japan. But even with these early moments of comfort, the reality on the ground was harsh. Daily life in ruins. Japan entered the occupation on the edge of collapse. Bombing raids had destroyed more than 60 cities. Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya were flattened. Millions of civilians were homeless. Train lines were damaged. Industry was crippled. Food production had fallen dangerously low. In the summer of 1945, many civilians were living in makeshift shelters built from scraps of wood, tin, or whatever they could salvage. Entire neighborhoods had become informal tent villages. Every day was a struggle to find food, water, and warmth. Rationing continued even after the war ended. People stood in long lines for tiny portions of rice or barley. Black markets grew quickly. Civilians traded anything they had left. Clothing, tools, jewelry, and family heirlooms were exchanged for food. Malnutrition was so widespread that school children often fainted in class. Adults skipped meals so children could eat. Doctors worried about the health of an entire generation. American occupation authorities eventually brought in emergency food shipments. But it took time for the system to stabilize. Until then, civilians relied on creativity, community, and sheer endurance to get through each day. These struggles did not stop the occupation authorities from pushing major changes across society. The purge of military influence. One of the earliest goals of the occupation was to strip Japan of its militaristic structure. This meant removing high-ranking officers from positions of authority and dismantling the organizations that had defined public life. Civilians saw rapid changes around them. Teachers who had once promoted wartime ideology disappeared from classrooms. Police chiefs and local officials were removed overnight. Newspapers changed their tone almost immediately. Public gatherings that once celebrated military victories no longer existed. This sudden shift created confusion. Some civilians felt hopeful, others felt lost, unsure who was in charge or what rules to follow. Japan's old system had collapsed, but the new system had not yet taken shape. That new system would soon arrive in the form of sweeping political and social reforms. The new role of women, one of the most dramatic changes of the occupation, was the expansion of women's rights. Before 1945, Japanese women had little legal power. They could not vote. Their rights within marriage were limited. Educational and professional opportunities were restricted. The American occupation changed this quickly. Women gained the right to vote. They gained property rights. They gained access to political office. In the 1946 election, millions of women voted for the first time in Japan's history. Dozens were elected to the National Diet. These changes were transformative, but social attitudes lagged behind. Many men resisted the idea of women working outside the home. Some communities frowned on women who became politically active. But the legal foundation for gender equality had been laid, and that foundation would grow stronger in the decades ahead. While these reforms reshaped gender roles, another part of daily life became impossible to ignore: life around American soldiers. American soldiers lived in Japan for the entire occupation. They worked in cities, trained on bases, and moved through public spaces daily. Civilians interacted with them constantly. Some relationships were friendly, others were tense. Children were often the first to approach American troops. Soldiers carried chocolate, chewing gum, and canned food. For many children, these were luxuries they had never tasted before. Adults were more cautious. Some were grateful for the stability the soldiers brought. Others felt uneasy living under foreign control. Some were angry about the presence of a past enemy. Bars, restaurants, small shops, and entertainment districts appeared around American bases. These businesses helped many civilians survive the harsh post-war economy. At the same time, they changed the look and feel of local neighborhoods, creating a blend of Japanese life and American culture. Romantic relationships between American servicemen and Japanese women also became common. Some led to marriage. Others were brief. These relationships drew mixed reactions from both societies. They raised questions about loyalty, identity, and the boundaries of the occupation. But relationships were only one part of a broader cultural shift. American influence on Japanese culture. During the occupation, Japan was exposed to American media and consumer culture. Movies, music, magazines, and cartoon characters entered mainstream life. Jazz clubs opened. Hollywood films played in cities. English words entered everyday conversation. Young people embraced these influences more quickly than older generations, creating a growing divide between pre-war and post-war ways of thinking. American culture did not replace Japanese culture. Instead, the two mixed. This blend shaped fashion, entertainment, language, and even humor. But while new freedoms entered Japanese society, old fears remained, bringing soldiers and civilians home. One of the biggest challenges of the occupation was the return of Japanese civilians and soldiers from abroad. Millions of people had been scattered across Asia during the war. Soldiers were stationed in China, Korea, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific. Civilians lived in colonial settlements in places like Taiwan and Manchuria. When the war ended, all of these people had to come home. Ships arrived almost daily, carrying tired, malnourished, often traumatized returnees. Many had nowhere to go. Cities had been destroyed. Families were missing or displaced. Jobs were scarce. Civilians struggled to reintegrate. Veterans carried trauma. People who had lived abroad for years felt out of place in a homeland they barely recognized. These returning soldiers and civilians added pressure to a country already dealing with shortages and destruction. Meanwhile, a major political shift was taking place. A new constitution and new rights. In 1947, the occupation authorities introduced a new constitution. It reshaped Japanese society in ways most civilians had never imagined. It guaranteed civil rights, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and limits on government power. The most dramatic change was Article 9, which declared that Japan would never maintain a military for war again. For civilians, the constitution changed daily life gradually. Schools introduced new textbooks that emphasized democracy, individual rights, and critical thinking. Teachers were retrained, community groups formed, political parties reorganized. The atmosphere of the country shifted from strict nationalism to an appreciation of civic responsibility. But even with new freedoms and rights, life was still hard. The food crisis and survival. In the first years of the occupation, food scarcity reached dangerous levels. Poor harvests and damaged farmland made things worse. Civilians lined up for hours for rations of rice or bread. Black markets remained active, and malnutrition became widespread. Teachers described classrooms full of tired, hungry children. Hospitals treated patients for starvation, related illnesses. Families survived through creativity and sacrifice. The American occupation eventually brought in emergency food shipments and established school lunch programs. These efforts kept millions of children healthy enough to continue their education and contributed to stabilizing the country. Life slowly began improving, but the occupation still had one more profound effect on Japanese daily life: rebuilding identity and community. As the occupation continued into the early 1950s, Japan began rebuilding its cities, social structures, and identity. Neighborhoods were restored. Families found stability. Factories reopened. Small businesses resurfaced. And gradually, civilians felt that they were living not in an occupied country, but in a recovering one. People adapted to democratic values. Women became more active in public life. Younger generations embraced new music, books, ideas, and cultural influences. Older generations adjusted more slowly, but accepted that the pre-war world was gone. Communities rebuilt through cooperation and shared hardship. Civilians learned how to work with the occupation authorities. And slowly, Japan transformed from a devastated country to a stable society. When the occupation ended in 1952, many people felt relief. Japan regained sovereignty. The American troops stayed in bases, but the country now made its own decisions. The American occupation changed Japanese civilian life in immediate and long-lasting ways. Civilians lived through hunger, fear, curiosity, cultural exchange, and rapid transformation. They navigated new freedoms while coping with deep losses. They discovered American influence while rebuilding their own traditions. They endured one of the most drastic transitions any modern society has ever experienced. The Japan that emerged after 1952 was different from the Japan of 1945. It was more democratic, more open, more balanced, and more connected to the global world. These changes were the result of millions of civilians adapting, surviving, and rebuilding day by day under circumstances that were challenging but ultimately transformative. Their experiences shaped Japan's identity for generations.